Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Joan Engebretson, and I'm the managing editor at Telecompetitor. I'm really looking forward today to our session about key considerations for your BEAD application. I've seen some of the material that will be presented, and you should expect to learn a lot of valuable information. I also wanted to let you know that the webcast is being recorded. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to recognize and thank our sponsor, CostQuest. CostQuest Associates is a broadband consulting firm, data and software as a service application provider. The company specializes in economic cost modeling, broadband planning, mapping, government advisory, network valuation services, and developing GIS, geographic information system data, and software as a service applications for the broadband ecosystem. CostQuest is contracted by the FCC and NTIA to deliver the National Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric Data Set to support federal programs such as the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program, and other federal broadband programs. Next slide, please. So our agenda for today is to discuss how the Broadband Fabric data will be used in the BEAD program by NTIA, states, and applicants. We'll also look at the economics of broadband deployment from both the government and ISP perspectives. We'll look at which economic factors are necessary to ensure applicants choose areas that present viable business cases. And we'll look at a real-world state BEAD program example. I wanted to let attendees know that they can use the Q&A tool on your screen toolbar to enter questions. Feel free to enter those as you think of them. You don't have to wait until the end to ask them, although we will answer them at the end of the panel discussion. We have three very knowledgeable people from CostQuest on hand today. Mike Wilson is CostQuest's Vice President and Chief Revenue Officer. He leads CostQuest, business development team, a little bit different from Costco, while also supporting various professional services and consulting projects. In addition to business development, Mike oversees CostQuest's strategic marketing and client relations initiatives, and he focuses his consulting efforts on rural telecom, policy, universal service funding, interconnection, broadband mapping, and operational analysis for wireless, competitive, and incumbent local carriers. Rochelle Fretz is the Manager of Government Relations at CostQuest. She manages the company's state affairs and business development efforts related to state government contracting. She also supports federal affairs efforts by engaging with congressional delegations in DC from all states and territories. Jim Stegeman is the President and CEO of CostQuest. He has testified before Congress multiple times and is a recognized expert behind the development of the latest generation economic cost models and data used across telecom companies and governments for broadband deployment analysis and valuation. Jim leads the design and implementation of the Fabric locational data adopted by the FCC for the National Broadband Mapping effort, which is driving the allocations for NTIA's BEAD program. Jim led the design and implementation of the Connect America cost model that is still used in the FCC's Connect America Fund program to disperse $1.5 billion annually to fund broadband deployment. He also led the design, coding, and implementation of the broadband analysis model used by the FCC for the National Broadband Plan delivered to the U.S. Congress. Mike, I'm going to ask you to please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Joan. And I'm coming to you from sunny Seattle, which is actually also the home of the headquarters of Costco. We're a little different. We don't have the $1.50 hot dogs, but something we could consider down the road. So I'll take over from here and give you a quick update. Part of what we're going to do here is have some interactivity. So we're going to open up with a poll. And that poll question just helps us understand a little bit more about our audience. We'll have a few polls as we go through this program. So the first poll: how are you participating in the BEAD program? And this is assuming that given you're joining this webinar, you're going to participate in some manner. of the BEAD program. So if you don't mind, everybody on this call, take a look at the poll, answer the question to the best of your ability. While you're doing that, a little bit more of an introduction to us. I think most of the people on this call know us, but a little more context in that what we're talking about here, these perspectives on BEAD generally, our background is with all aspects as applicants, as reviewers, assessors of applications, and managers of funds, right? We work for the federal government, for the FCC and NTIA. We're the data supplier for the NTIA for the BEAD program. We are the data supplier to the FCC for the National Broadband Map and the National Broadband Funding Map. We work with states, large and small, across the U.S. And pass-through entities who are going to be awarding funds to help close the digital divide in states. And then we also work with ISPs, large and small, across the country, understanding things like their business cases, really surrounding things historically. Over 25 years, we've done valuation appraisal for ISPs, large and small. So we have the perspective that kind of runs the gamut of all participants in the program. So with that, I'll move on to one other poll here as we move forward with the program. Are you familiar with the National Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric Data? Right. So the location fabric data, I'll go into a little bit more detail on what it is. I know a lot of you know this, but I do want to give a quick update on what that is. So if you're familiar, just let us know. If you're somewhat familiar, let us know. If you have no idea, it's okay. We're going to go through a very quick primer of the National Broadband Fabric. Okay. And here are the results of that. About split. Yes, and somewhat. It's good to know that 86% of you know what the fabric is to some degree. So for those that answer somewhat and know, a lot of this is kind of a primer on the broadband fabric in the first few slides here. Okay, so moving on. All right. The National Broadband Fabric is a data set that shows where broadband serviceable structures are, where people live and work, right? It's a Herculean effort to actually put this data together. We have a big team that has been working on this for more than 5 years now. It is an aggregation of hundreds of millions of data points across the country to identify the rooftops of every location that can be connected with broadband. Our data sources are many. Here's a few: parcels, satellite imagery, commercial building footprint data, tax attributes, address data sets, multiple address data sets, road segments, road types, US Census data, and many, many more data attributes go into us building this. So the fabric is really just providing a national foundation of all locations. It's used by multiple federal agencies, not just the FCC and NTIA. It is a service availability. It's data that you can layer service availability on for the FCC, right, for the broadband data collection. The BDC program. It's contributing to the National Broadband Map, the National Broadband Funding Map. It serves obligations for funding, including ACP, USF. Like if you're filing to the hub, you understand that this data is supporting those obligations as well. And then NTIA, but it's actually not just NTIA and BEAD, but it's all federal broadband granting authorities and agencies, right? So NTIA, U.S. Department of Commerce, has access to this data, but so does the Department of Interior and USDA and RUS, right? The Treasury programs use this data. The fabric, not to put too fine a point on it, the Fabric location data set is the underlayment for all of these federal programs, and it is, pardon the term, the kind of the common currency to exchange for setting data out for compliance with these programs, et cetera. So that is, in a nutshell, the location Fabric data set, the quick version. How to access this data, I know many in looking at some of the names on this call, I know many of you are already Tier D licensees. So what we talk about in terms of licensing of our data, the federal government makes this data available to participants in programs like BDC and BEAD. You just have to sign a licensing agreement and use the data for those specified needs of the program, right? Nothing outside of those uses in the program, right? For the BEAD program, it is called a Tier D license, right? For the BDC, the licenses were numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. For the BEAD program and NTIA, the licenses are A, B, C, D, and E. So the D licensing is for sub-grantees, right? And those are authorized participants in the program, like ISPs and counties or whoever's participating in assessing and applying for grant funds. So the license specifically covers participating, reporting, challenging those use cases for the BEAD program, right? And other federal broadband programs like the Treasury programs, et cetera. It does not allow use for state granting programs or commercial uses outside of participation in these federal granting programs at all. Be cognizant of the permitted uses under the license. There are ongoing audits of this and et cetera. So it's a matter of these programs use this data for the specified use of the program, and the D license is extended to those sub-grantees that want to use it for those programs. So I'm going to hand this off to Rochelle Fretz, who is also here in Seattle and actually did used to work at Costco. And now she works here with her two great interns, Lou and Remy, who are dogs that are probably at her feet right now. But Rochelle, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mike. And hi, everyone. Lou and Remy are out of the building because they will probably be barking. So
Good.
And yeah, I did work at Costco and I went to CostQuest, and so my grandmother is very confused. But it's okay. She's 92, so we let her think what she wants. Has Mike reviewed what is in the Fabric and how we identify locations and how to access the Fabric through the Tier D license? I'm going to review how the Fabric changes over time through the BDC and our own internal self-challenge processes, and then how that may affect how your states are using the Fabric for their BEAD efforts. So let me, next slide here. There we go. So each state will be using different versions of the Fabric and BDC data pulled from the National Broadband Map. So one of the key things here is you'll want to keep an eye out for which version to work off of, and that it matches what your state is using. So if you are an ISP or working with ISPs who are going to be putting in bids in multiple states, it might be different in every state. So this slide just kind of outlines the Fabric versions from 2 to soon to be 5. And it will also maybe outlined in the volume 2 proposals what version the state will be using. Throughout the process, a state can up version, just to add another layer of complexity here. So basically, a state can use one version of the fabric for the challenge process and then use the latest version for their grant efforts. So they can change the version they are using because of the changes in the location data and availability data, which we'll review here on the next few slides. So your broadband office will be a great resource to use, and maintaining a good relationship with them throughout the process will also be beneficial. They may be hosting state-specific workshops and webinars. It's just good to have a point of contact throughout this process with your state broadband office. So the fabric changes from version to version. And so it's updated through two challenge processes, the public challenge process, the BDC challenge, and then also our own internal challenge process. So with each iteration, BSLs are added and or removed from the fabric. From version 1 to version 2, there was a large push in the front end to challenge the fabric through the BDC process alongside our own internal self-challenge process. So we saw a larger change from version 1 to version 2. Now we're getting to the point where changes are becoming more steady. So while both of the challenge processes are continuous, the change from version to version is a bit more stable. So the CostQuest identification process has gotten more and more accurate. We use a learning model. So as it takes in all the new information, it's becoming more accurate. There will always be changes from version to version as new construction is getting completed. And right now, that's actually where we're seeing the largest change. So new developments are getting finished, folks are moving in and getting connected to service. And so on that side, there's also availability challenges. And so that can change the served status of each location between versions. So while a location may stay on the map, it could go from underserved to served, unserved to underserved. So that's what this sand key here is depicting, the service availability changes from version 2 to 3. So one of the the key things here is served locations went up 2.5%. So as I mentioned previously, a state may want to up version because there are more locations that have moved to served in this case. And so then if there's less locations to divide the funding amongst, they will have a more successful program. And then here you can see the number of underserved locations went down and unserved locations went down as well. So if you're interested in looking at this sand key in more detail, it is available on our website. So this is a quick calendar here of when you can expect the upcoming iterations. Next one coming up here in June. So the data is refreshed every 6 months. So if a state is starting the challenge process in June, they probably wouldn't up version just because the time period doesn't overlap. So if the state starts at the release, they will most likely stay at that same version throughout the process. And then, so with the understanding of how the fabric works and changes, it's critical to know how states are approaching their BEAD program deployments. So the states are tasked with maximizing the amount of locations served and leveraging those funds to efficiently serve all corners of their state. Ideally, each state is going to look at their applications that they get holistically, from the match percentage to the number of locations served in the proposed area, as well as company financials. While the applicants and ISPs will be looking at how many locations they can take on as an obligation to serve, the cost to serve, and how that affects their long-term financial viability. So it's kind of this teeter-totter that everyone's kind of going to find balance in. So a high-level overview here of the BEAD programs. Right now, more than half the states are in the challenge process. 13 have open challenges right now. And I think this is when I looked earlier this week, 18 states are in the process of working through their challenge evidence and rebuttals. So that information is available on NTI's like Internet for All website. So keep an eye out on that. And participating in that state challenge process will make sure that your voice is heard, but also making sure that you're challenging the national map. As we said, states may upversion throughout the challenge process. So it's the best way to make sure areas you plan to bid on are as accurate as possible. States have laid out their program guidelines, and we will go deeper into some of these aspects later in the presentation. Most of it can be found in their Volume 2 proposal. Right now, only 4 states have gotten their go-ahead on the Volume 2 proposal. And just a side note, once that Volume 2 is approved, it starts the clock on them running the grant process. They have a year to get the grant process going, distribute the awards, and report back to NTIA on those outcomes. So just wanted to highlight some items to pay attention in the program guidelines. Some states may have a gating process, meaning you have to pre-qualify to bid in BEAD. So keep an eye out for that in their proposal, and check in with the state broadband office on dates. Another item here is understanding how they're putting together their project areas. Is it at the location level or the county level? That makes a big difference on your obligations to serve, how much funding you would need, and then also identifying what areas are on the grant score sheet to strengthen your proposal. Each state may have different socioeconomic factors, environmental priorities that will go in and may help weigh your bid in your favor. So having a bid strategy ahead of time with each state that you plan to bid in will definitely be helpful, as each state is on a different timeline. They may be using different versions of the fabric, and they all have different priorities. So, and then at the end of it, they'll make their awards, and then you'll have to report your progress to the state as you're building out. The other large piece of the puzzle that's still a bit murky is how states will use or not use the extremely high cost threshold. The EHCT is the high cost point where states can consider alternative technologies like fixed wireless, satellite, etc., to maximize the BEAD funds that they have available. So the question that needs to be answered is really, how much is the state willing to spend to get fiber to each unserved BSL? At this point, most states are holding their cards, saying after the first round, they will enter into negotiations for locations that were not chosen in that first round, or that a threshold will be set after the first round of applications. So that just gives the state a better understanding of what locations are left to serve and what the cost to serve those areas is. And some states may be holding off because they think right now that they have all of the funding to serve all corners of their state without having to set that threshold. So once the state is ready to receive bids, they will run through their sub-grantee selection process. So some of the key program features on running their program will be anonymizing bids to keep out bias, encoding the program rules and the scoring rules to score the bids, and including a bid deconfliction approach. So that will be something to note, which is how they will approach an application with overlapping locations with other bids. And then bidders will apply through their state's grant application system. And, you'll have to fill out the required application fields. So identifying type of technology, amount of funds that are requested, number of months to complete the build out. So that is the overview on the state side. So I'm going to hand this over to Jim to walk through kind of the ISP perspective.
Thanks, Rochelle. Thanks for that overview. And where I'm going to take it is I'm going to take it to the other side of the scale, talk about the ISP perspective, whereas you covered the state perspective. But before I do that, let's run the next poll. And this one is, as you think about your plans, how many states do you plan to submit BEAD applications for? Curious as, is it 1, 2 to 5, or more than 5? To understand kind of the concepts and things we need to talk about through the rest of this presentation. Interesting that there are 13% of the participants here will participate more than 5 programs, which leads into some of the discussion we'll talk about. Is as you think about those 5 or more state programs, there are complexities and differences that we see in all the programs, and that's what we're going to walk through as we move through this. So the first thing you have to understand, and as Rochelle pointed out, the state will publish in their volume 2 their guidelines. So it walks through what funding may be available or how you request funding, and the states approach it differently. They'll talk about their project areas, and those project areas do differ significantly across the states. They'll talk about the requirements to bid, and they'll talk about what you have to do to achieve the scoring that may be in their matrix to win a potential grant. So as we first focus on state project areas, it represents the geographic aggregation of location level areas of unserved and unserved locations available for BEAD. So this goes back to what Mike discussed in the fabric. So the fabric is published, provided to the FCC, provided to the ISPs. They report their coverage to the FCC. From that, we identify what is served and unserved and underserved. That then forms the basis of what goes into the state's challenge process that we're not really going to cover in depth today. But from that, we identify the fabric locations that are eligible for the state's BEAD program. So that's all behind the scenes here on this slide. Once they get those locations, the state will then identify what are the available project areas. And they may adjust either the project areas or attributes about those project areas. And the attributes may be that the project area is economically disadvantaged. It may have tribal coverage in it, or there may be funding associated with that. That may change between round 1 and round 2 if the state actually has multiple rounds. So as we've looked across the volume 2s that have been submitted, some approved, as Rochelle said, we're seeing multiple types of project areas. Louisiana, for example, uses hex 9s. So hex 9s, if you're unfamiliar with hex 9s, are an Uber identified polygon. It's a hexagon. The hex 9 identifies the size of the polygon. A 9 has sides that are 200 meters long, so they're relatively small polygons that capture area. And within that area, locations can be identified. It's become kind of a universal let me say, geographic shape that provides some normalcy across platforms that people can look at. In other state programs, we've seen census tract, block groups, blocks. Those are census-defined shapes. The issue with census tracts, census blocks, and census block groups is they're not standard in shape like a hex 9. So you have to understand what those census blocks are, what shape they contain, how big they are, and what locations are in it. If we shift to locations, locations are actually at the smallest geographic level. It's the actual individual fabric location that is eligible for BEAD funding. We've seen that in Texas and in some other state programs that they may allow participants to aggregate points into their own project areas. There may be objective-driven clustering. This is more the state trying to identify how best to form the clusters, either to meet the state's objectives or to meet engineering perspective. And I'll walk a bit through that. We have seen cities, counties, and school districts also mentioned. So as you're considering applying in multiple states, it's an important note to understand how those project areas will be defined and how you need to look at that data to create the project areas that you will bid upon. So as you think about bidding on those project areas, you need to think about the technology that you will consider. As Rochelle mentioned, many of the states are holding back on identifying the exact extremely high cost threshold number. They will identify it, many of them will identify it after the bids are submitted and identify where they need to set it to maximize their coverage that they can get with the BEAD dollars they have. So as you look at that, you need to understand, am I just going to submit a fiber bid? Am I going to do wireless? If you do wireless, you have to realize that you don't know necessarily where that extremely high cost threshold will be. Will I partner with another company on the project or not? If you consider Louisiana, we bring up Louisiana a number of times through this presentation, I'll hit it again later on. Louisiana is the first state that was approved with Volume 2. Their grants will be going off soon. So it's just an interesting state to look at simply for the fact it's the first out the gate. And in that, what Louisiana has done is they've actually incorporated some additional scoring criteria that rely on mobility, hardening of towers, mobility deployment. And if you think about that, if you're a provider and you look at that and you want to maximize your score, you may want to partner with a mobile firm that you can then achieve a higher score. There are other firms that you may want to partner with in which they may have facilities that you can lease to minimize your capital outlay, to maximize your potential to win the area. And then as you consider the technology, you need to think about how those project areas that you've identified meet your technology type and maximize your capability to win. Do you have the facilities in that area to leverage from, or do you want to partner with somebody? Do I have other skills and attributes that may help me achieve maximum scoring? So that scoring is really important to understand in each of the state's processes to understand where you need to look for additional resources or capabilities to maximize your capability to win. As you think about these project areas, we hit on this because it is an important, one of the key attributes of all the state programs. The size of the project area affects how the applicants bid, but the price, the technology, other attributes in that. And states may form those to achieve certain goals that they have of the program. They may incorporate some higher cost locations into their available project areas so as to make sure those high cost locations have access to potential technologies that may not be available if they're bid on their own. So the project areas can expand the pool of participants. So if you think of Texas, those project areas being point level may entice participants in because of the required capital constraint that goes into it is under your control. I can do 10 locations, I do 100 locations. I can control what I bid upon. However, as you think about those small location areas, it becomes complex for the state to evaluate, or it can be. The biggest issue is the deconfliction that Rochelle touched upon. Deconfliction is where project bids from multiple participants have overlapping locations. The smaller the project area or the state's starting point, the higher the chance for confliction amongst bids. And you have to read through the state guidelines as to how they will handle those conflictions. And the states do differ in that approach. If you think about the larger project areas are administratively easier to handle, but they may be a barrier to some entrance. For example, if you go to county level, it becomes a fairly large capital issue for some smaller providers who may say, I can't necessarily serve a full county. So just consider as you go into this, what is the size of that area? And how does it benefit you, or how does it benefit the competitor that you may be up against? So let's think about just the comparison of the project areas. These are a few that we've worked on. CASA it has been used in California in some of their state programs. It stands for a carrier agnostic serving area. They're typically a large cluster of BSLs, typically defined using aggregation of census shapes. And you can see those on the screen in the upper portion, that some of those project areas that are CASA-based can be full cities, but they can also be fairly small. And again, that formation, that is left to the state to decide how best to form the project areas they want. If we look at SPAs, which are a Louisiana approach, SPA stands for sub-project area. There are smaller clusters of BSLs, and they are hex 9 based. And you can see that in the lower image that you see. The highlighted SPA cluster that you see there in purple has 377 locations, so much smaller. And they were formed according to more engineering-based criteria as compared to the CASAs, which are formed based upon census aggregation. So the smaller the area, as I discussed on the last slide, allows parties to create their own aggregate project areas that more fall in line with where they can deploy efficiently and feel that they can win the grant. So, factors you should consider as you're reviewing project areas. One, as I mentioned, review the requirements of the state program to determine which ones you will likely participate in. Decide which type of state project areas you want to apply for. If you're bidding in multiple states, which many of you are, do you want to go after states with certain specific geographic attributes? Are they hex 9 states? Are they county level, location level? Or is it that you want to go after those states where that is a benefit to you? If a county is the use in a state and you serve a portion of that county, it may be beneficial for you to go after those types of states where counties are the aggregate points. So that's one key part. The other key part is to know who's registered in the state, if that will be made public, because that helps determine the level of competition you will face as you put together your grants in that state. So as you think about their scoring rubric, you need to understand how you can maximize your score. And if part of that score is based upon your total capital bid, are you at a deficiency in an area where there's an incumbent who has expressed interest and they're just expanding outwards versus you're coming in and building a greenfield network? So a lot of that is dependent upon your analysis of what's available. Some of that can be made available by the FCC's data from the broadband data collection effort to understand where carriers are and where they're not. Some of that's available in commercial data sets that we have. If you're interested, we can help you on that. But it's really important to understand that because in part, you want to make sure you can focus your resources on those grants that you feel you have the capability to win. And finally, as you think about the project areas that you're going to bid on, you have to understand, again, the state rules as to what will be used in that scoring criteria, as I've hit on. So one, you remember that in the BEAD NOFO, there is a 25% match requirement that may be called out in the state program, or it may be embedded in what they've identified as the reference funding for an area. You have to understand how much of the funding you will need. And again, you need to understand that as you look at that, as I said on the last slide, the level of competition to understand at what level do you really need to set your bid to be able to achieve winning? And then what additional scoring criteria will be of benefit and create issues potentially for other parties that provide a benefit for you? So if you just look at that image, it's one of the at spas in the state of Louisiana. There are 494 unserved BSLs in that. What the state of Louisiana has done is they said, this is our reference funding amount for that area, $400,000. You get a score of how much that funding you request. So if you request 200,000, you get a better score. If you request 600,000, your score reduces. So again, understanding the state program, how they're scoring is a key attribute for you who are bidding into the state program. And with that, Mike, I think I'm handing it back to you.
Thanks, Jim. You know, a lot of what Jim discussed is kind of highlighting the complexity of the program, and right, it's a great opportunity, but there's lots to consider. And so some of what I'll talk about is kind of that the economic financial considerations going forward. I'll do it quickly because I want to leave time for questions. But so questions like, how will you factor in for those who are potentially going to go after BEAD funding with multi-modes of technology, right? Fiber, fixed wireless typically, right? So important to look at the fiber costs compared to the fixed wireless costs. Is there a big gap? Compare the business case, wireless versus fiber. Determine the switching of technologies, where it is geographically, right? A lot of that is determined by density. But I think you also need to go a little bit deeper and think about, okay, this isn't just the investment that's needed, the upfront capital, but it's the operations and maintenance costs over time. It's the success-based capital, the expense, the cost to turn up a new customer, right? So in some cases, O&M, operations and maintenance over 10, 20 years in fixed wireless might be a little bit higher than fiber in rural remote areas, right? It's, you know, maintaining towers at a remote distance can be costly, right? Things about customer prem equipment when you're looking at the cost to turn up a customer, success-based capital, as we call it, right? What is that difference going to be in your evaluation of what technology to use between fiber and fixed wireless, right? It goes a lot deeper than what's my investment. It goes deep into the financials and looks at the scenario of turning up customers. Moving ahead to the next slide, there's a lot of detail that I would characterize as interdependencies, right? These decisions, when I talk about them, may sound obvious, right? So some points to consider. What's the market size of project area? How many unserved broadband serviceable locations or BSLs are there in the project area? Which carriers are providing service nearby? What other infrastructure may be currently there? All these questions you need to answer, and then there's decisions related to those answers. And so when you think of this as a whole, right, in the parts, they seem like pretty simple questions, getting to return on investment. But you need to look at those answers and some of the decisions that you're looking at as interplaying with one another. And you also need to look at what you see as the competition out there who may bid in these BEAD areas. What are they going to do? Are they going to have a defensive strategy if they're already certificated or serving an area historically? And understanding that it's almost goes into, even though this isn't technically a reverse auction, it does go into game theory, and really just the game theory here is just how decisions are interdependent. And so thinking about this gets pretty complex when you're just thinking about it as your own internal decisions. That's one thing, but thinking about it in terms of as Jim pointed out, what is someone else going to do? It needs to come in play. What is the competition's cost profile versus yours? What's the proximity to these unserved BEAD eligible areas as compared to yours? What is your cost profile versus theirs? Maybe they're a larger, smaller company with a different purchasing power. What's their cost of compliance versus your cost of compliance? So all of these things you need to weigh in for yourself, but also those are interdependent decisions that others are going to make as well, and trying to figure that out as a whole is pretty complex. But all of these things need to be answered and more. Right. So when we look at this as a cost modeling firm, and you think about the data that you have available to you for this program, right? Starting with your Tier D license for NTIA, and setting that, the exact geographic coordinates of the BSLs that are eligible, and then bringing in, right? This is going to be super helpful to you understanding who's nearby, who might bid, but that BDC data that is the service availability submitted by carriers. Where are they in proximity? What kind of carrier are they, right? How close is where you think their endpoint of fiber is? And understanding how many competitors are out there, what type of technology, what size, again, proximity and linear feet to the areas that you want to potentially bid on. So starting with that fabric, the common currency of data that is supporting these programs, and then layering on these other things to help you understand who's going to be bidding potentially in those areas is pretty critical, right? And then as you kind of look at your business case, right, understanding not only where the BSLs are that are unserved and BEAD eligible, but how difficult is it to build there? What is the terrain like? Is it going to be conducive to fiber? Is it going to be aerial, underground, buried? Are you going to have to trench? Or are you going to draw it up on poles? Understanding soil, understanding terrain, clutter, things like that weigh in not only for fiber, but for fixed wireless. So what's your cost profile, right? Cost to deploy and serve a location, not just upfront investment, but as I mentioned, that investment plus success-based capital plus operations and maintenance to run the business, you really need to understand that. Service availability, it really comes down to, what's nearby and what is the adoption going to be for those people that don't have service available to them. What's the profile demographics of that area? What do you expect the adoption rates of broadband are, fiber potentially? And what would your take rate be if there's someone else in that area that's close by and could enter the market later? And average revenue per user, understanding that to get to the full equation of a business case, right? Really what we're getting down to here is what public funding is needed for you to be made whole to serve that area. And then also thinking about the cost profile of other potential participants, and is their cost profile and resulting net present value going to be significantly different than yours potentially? And so thinking this through kind of as a process to go through to get to a business case is important, to have all this data and understanding of not only your profile, the market demographics, the expected revenue, but potentially some thoughts on your competitors and what that might be for your competitors. So a little bit more on this. It's really something I've already stated most of this, right? Initial investment, capital expenditures over time, operating expenses, O&M, costs to maintain over time, adoption and take rates, and then the potential revenue to get to net present value. So other things to consider as we throw this out for questions, as we're running low on time, where you're applying in the states you're applying, are there other things that can contribute to the success of the program as you're applying for it, right? Does the state have workforce training programs? We talked a little bit about Louisiana. Louisiana has worked with counties and communities and community colleges on program certifications to build local assets and have an installation workforce. Workforce development is really key, right? Are you going to have the workforce to support building out the networks for your obligations in terms of time and material and getting it up and running in time to meet your BEAD obligations? So those things that are really important to you meeting the obligations are related to how you deploy and when you deploy. So state BEAD example, Louisiana. I'll let Jim talk a little bit more about this. Jim, you want to finish this up here and then we'll take questions.
Yeah, let me run through this quick because I know we're running short on time. Most of this we've covered through the presentation today, so hopefully there's nothing new on most of this. We've talked about the Louisiana program. The only reason we highlight it, well, there's two reasons. One is Louisiana's first out the gate. Two is we're helping Louisiana institute their grant award program. So we have some in-depth knowledge on how they're running it. So it just helps on that part. The big thing about Louisiana is they're running with SPAs, which we talked about, and they are posting the reference funding amount. It's important to understand that reference funding amount because it's important in the scoring. So, lost my mouse. Sorry. Their primary criteria for scoring is 500 points. The first is the BEAD outlay, which refers back to that funding amount that they posted. So how you bid according to that. So that's one of the key things to understand and take away from the Louisiana program. They also have the critical resiliency need areas, which talk about wireless, local and tribal coordination. You get points for that. So again, understanding the program is important to understand how to bid into the program and achieve your desired goals. As far as the grant management system, as I mentioned, we are developing the grant award system for the state of Louisiana. It's instituting the Volume 2 rules, which are quite complex, into a system that allows participants to come in anonymously to avoid system bias. It encodes all the rules. It has quality control up front to make sure those bids, as they come in, are accepted before the time frame at which the program shuts down. There are dry runs available so that participants know what's going on, and it has a deconfliction process. With that, I'm going to stop. Hopefully, you've taken away from this and understanding the fabric, why it's important to understand the fabric, because that fabric plays into the BEAD programs. It's important to understand the Tier D licensing, the up-versioning to understand which version of the license data you should be using, to understand the project areas in those state programs. So as we finish up, there's a couple questions that came in. I'll take the first one, which is probably a very confusing term used throughout, and that's the challenge. There are actually 3 challenge process, and the question is, can you elaborate on the challenge process itself? Here's the issue. There's 3. The FCC runs 2, and we've talked about 2 of them. One is the fabric challenge process, in which parties can challenge the fabric locations, addresses, attributes. Challenge 2 at the FCC is coverage challenges. So I can challenge the coverage that a carrier may report on my address. I can challenge that and get it corrected in the fabric. So that's what the FCC does on their challenges, and that's what we've covered. There is then that data is transferred over to the states to run the BEAD programs. They run their own state challenge processes that are independent of the FCC. And those state challenge processes are only on coverage. You cannot challenge the fabric location data in the state challenge process. You can only do that in the FCC side. So it's important to understand that once that data is pulled over to the states, the only thing left in the state challenge process is the coverage and whether that point is served or underserved. And with that, I'll hand it to Mike. Do you want to handle the next question?
Actually, I'm going to jump in. It's Joan, because I
Okay.
just wanted to extend to the audience the option of asking questions. Just a reminder that you can use the Q&A button on your toolbar and type in your question. We'll get to as many as we can. And yeah, so the next question that we have is, does your data include fiber drop lengths? So I guess, Mike, you might as well jump in there.
So our data, when we do our cost modeling, we do understand and look at drop length for fiber, right? We've got to model a cost model that NTIA uses that understands getting to the drop. And so as far as our data that we have available in the tier D and tier 2, no, it doesn't come with that data, and our commercial data doesn't include drop links per se, but it gives you the drop location in terms of coordinates, rooftop level accuracy.
Great. And another one just came in. Oh, we always get the question, can a copy of the slides be obtained? Yes, they are automatically shared with anyone who registered. You'll also get a link to the actual recording. Any other questions? Please feel free to use the Q&A button on your toolbar. I had one question occurred to me as I was, watching your talk, and I've talked to some of you before in the past too, is what are you doing with AI? Because it seems like that could be really useful when you talked about all these different sources of information you have, aerial imagery and so on and so forth. And then you try to resolve, is this really a location or not? It seems like AI could be really helpful with that. Is that something you're delving into?
Yes. Yeah, quite a bit, right? So AI, specifically machine learning, we do a lot of, right? So, and that is helping us understand what is and what is not a broadband serviceable location, right? A lot of that has to do with what we see in imagery and building footprints, and how the architectural features of a home might be different than architectural features of a barn, and standard dimensions and things like that. We teach through AI, through machine learning, our algorithms to recognize these patterns and identify the proper structure. But we don't just rely on AI. We actually need human discernment and eyeballs. We've had a lot of humans looking, trained, proud, looking at our imagery. Over 2 million locations have been looked at by humans to help train AI better, right? But also kind of make a decision or discernment on what's on a parcel in some cases. Jim, anything to add?
No, I think you hit it on it well. The satellite imagery AI is used on that to actually pick out the polygon of every building in the country. It's an interesting exercise. We're expanding that into more smart ag attributes as well, to pick out silos and other things that may be useful in future programs that are trying to help on broadband deployment.
It's a great question, John.
Another one that came, thanks. Another one that came in is this person noticed that some Louisiana SPAs appear to be in the marsh or bayou, and they lack road and electric utility access. How do you advise broadband offices and participants on such situations, since service is questionable and cost would be high to service or maintain?
Yeah, I can take a shot at that. First, this goes back to the fabric challenges. So once the FCC releases the fabric locations, the states have to go with it. So it's not that they can't challenge a fabric location. So if it's in the marsh, it's part of the BEAD program. There are capabilities for the state to petition NTIA for the removal of that, or to look at alternative technologies to serve that location. What the state has from NTIA is our cost profile. So most likely, the cost to run fiber to that location is extremely high. So the state has that information at their fingertips to understand what is the potential investment that's going to be triggered. So as they determine the extremely high cost threshold, they can use that information to better make a decision of how to use their BEAD funding.
We are all out of time. This was really informative today. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. And thank you to Mike and Rochelle and Jim for all your insight on this. And thanks to all the participants who logged on.
Thank you.
Thank you to Telecompetitor. We appreciate it.